Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers, Client Build 22, Part 3. Let's get straight back into it where we left off. The final new component for the build has now arrived. It's an EK pump and reservoir configuration. I'm going to replace the new reservoir tube with the old one because, as you can see, the old one is a lot longer. And for this build, I want the pump and res config to go almost the full height of the case. At the end of the last video, we started to take a look at this incredible motherboard, the MSI Z170A Xpower Gaming Titanium Edition. Let's continue, starting with a look at the included accessories. So we have a nice big thick manual, plenty of documentation. Some of this would be for the included software. And some of the included software looks very useful, particularly the overclocking software. We have a door hanger, some labels, we have a USB 3 extension cable with a 90-degree connection on one end. We have 6 SATA 3 cables, the drivers and software disk, a nice looking rear I/O cover panel, a very long SLI bridge, looks like 4-slot. We have the voltage readout point cables and a case badge. I can't wait to get this system up and running so that I can have a play with this motherboard, do some overclocking and see what it's really capable of. I was really surprised when I used the MSI X99A Godlike Gaming just how many settings there are for overclocking and how incredibly stable that board actually is. I think I had a golden chip as well, but just overclocking on it was such a breeze and a lot of fun and an incredibly stable board. And this board has a lot of overclocking features. So starting in the top left-hand corner, we have the 4-pin ATX and 8-pin APS. Moving across the top, we have a 4-pin PWM, another one in the top right-hand corner. And then we have this MSI OC dashboard. So a little PCB with a lot of features on it. You can see the plus and minus buttons on both ends. That would be for voltage and megahertz. We have a power and reset button, an overclocking button, probably for profiles or automated overclocking. We have the voltage readout points. And then we have this small button and switch for other overclocking features. Now this is only part of the overclocking features on this motherboard. And it's obviously direct overclocking. So while the system is up and running, you can change BIOS settings. I mean, similar to doing it within software within the operating system, but you know, with something like this, it can help out in certain situations. I'm really surprised at just how clean this PCB is. I mean, I'm used to PCBs a lot more crowded than this one. It's because of the high quality components that are being used, the tantalum capacitors and all of that. So moving down, we have the 24-pin. We then have a USB 3.1, which is at 90 degrees. And the USB 3 also at 90 degrees. That is great to see. I mean, all of them should be at 90 degrees, and so should the 24-pin. I mean, all of these connections should be at 90 degrees. Same across the bottom of the board. 8 SATA 3, 2 SATA Express there. And another overclocking feature here. This button looks like it has some sort of dial on it as well. I'll have to have a play with this when I get the system up and running. So that feels like a momentary switch, but OC1, and you can see the numbers around it. I'll find out exactly what that is for once we boot this build. We have another power and reset button, and we have another 4-pin PWM fan header. Up here we have the BIOS switch because this motherboard has dual BIOS. 2 USB 2 headers. And this is an awesome feature. Every board should have this. I've used this so many times, you know, when I've been overclocking and I've started to have problems. When you have water-cooled graphics cards and, you know, one of them dies or you need to switch one off for whatever reason, it's just great to have this feature. So we have 3 switches here for the PCI Express slots. We then have post 1 and post 2, 2 separate LED posters. Another 4-pin PWM fan header. Front panel audio, and we have the audio here, which is incredibly high quality. I'm amazed at the audio features that this board has. Very good. And we have a 6-pin PCIe extra power to the motherboard here. I don't like it when they do this. These should be placed up here somewhere, or even, you know, over here at a 90-degree angle as well. But at least you're going to be able to run it underneath this heatsink, as I mentioned in the previous video, and hide the cable. Another 4-pin PWM fan header for a total of 6 on this motherboard, which is not a huge amount compared to some other boards, but it's definitely more than enough. I don't even use the fan headers on the motherboard, you know, unless I'm using them for lighting. I always use fan splitters and run them directly from the power supply or from a fan controller, and a lot of other people are also doing that now. We have socket 1151, incredibly clean around the socket. The tantalum capacitors, amazingly high quality power delivery. There are 16 power phases there. And moving down, we have the PCIe slots, and we have this awesome feature to strengthen the PCIe slots, according to MSI, by 4 times, which is something that I would definitely like to have, in my own system. If you're going to be water cooling, it adds a lot of weight, and this feature really sorts it out nicely, and it looks great. So stainless steel covers on the PCIe slots. Now, the top one is wired for times 16, and the other 3 are wired for times 8. And then we have the times 4 or times 1 slots as well. They're all PCIe 3, of course. And we have 2 M.2 slots on this motherboard, which is just awesome. I love the symmetrical positioning of them. And depending on how many graphics cards you're going to be running, you may have to drop these back to SATA. But, even then, it's still an awesome feature for a more compact build to have M.2s instead of SSDs. I absolutely love the look of the heat sinks on this motherboard. Beautiful. I think it's CNC milled, or it might be cast alloy. Sandblasted and anodized for a really sparkly look. And it just goes perfectly. I mean, that's one of the big reasons that we chose this motherboard for this build. It was between this and the Asus Sabertooth, which has a similar color scheme to this board. Well, first of all, it just matches the custom paint perfectly, but then if you take a look at some of the other components we're using in this build, we have again the alloy, sandblasted and anodized silver, which is an absolutely perfect match. We then have the EVGA SLI bridge, again perfect match, the sparkly silver, and the SingularityComputers ethereal single reservoir mounts, again a perfect match to the color and finish. So perfect for the color scheme. Let's take a look at the rear I/O. Now, I would like to see a rear I/O cover. Still, that is really no big deal. I like it how the rear I/O has a color scheme, although red and black, the color scheme should match this board, and that's something that should also be done always. We have PS2 to USB 2, that would be probably clear CMOS. Another USB 2, that is probably for the USB BIOS flashback feature, which allows you to flash the BIOS when the motherboard has no CPU, no memory, and no graphics cards installed. And that is an awesome feature. I've used it a couple of times, very handy. We have USB 3, it's probably 3.1. We have HDMI, DisplayPort, LAN, and more USB 3.1. Some of it is Gen 1, some of it is Gen 2. So we have 6 in total. And then we have the 7.1 surround with the beautiful gold connections. It's time to prepare the motherboard for installation. I need to install the CPU, which is still in the previous motherboard. And I have a bit of a mess to clean up here. This is actually conductive thermal paste, but for cleaning up my TIM, I use ArctiClean. I have for a long time. It works great. And in combination with it, I start with a paper towel to clean up the bulk of the mess, and then I move on to a microfiber cloth. And I have a whole collection of microfiber cloths for all different things. I keep them in labeled zip-top bags because obviously you don't want to be getting them mixed up. You really don't want to use a microfiber cloth that has been used for TIM removal to polish a custom paint job, for example. We're then going to install the water block, and this is the EK Monoblock for this motherboard, an incredible block. We'll take a good look at it. And then the memory, which is a 32GB kit of Corsair Dominator Platinum DDR4. It runs at 2400 MHz, C14, 1.2 volts. And then I also need to install the 2 Samsung 950 Pro M.2s. One of them is actually 512 gig and the other one is 256 gig. So there will be obviously no RAID 0 for this build, but still an incredible configuration. Now it might be surprising for some of you how many problems thermal paste like this can cause, whether it's conductive or not conductive. If it gets into the socket, it's pretty much game over. The pins look like they're in good condition, and there is none on the pins, but It's all the way around and right next to it. It's actually made it down onto the bottom of the CPU and even on some of the contact points. I've now installed the CPU into the new motherboard and it's as clean as I can possibly get it. I don't want to try to clean it any further because otherwise it can damage it. And I'm now applying the OptiClean Thermal Surface Purifier because I've already cleaned it up with the thermal material remover. So OptiClean has two products. The first product is quite corrosive, to remove the thermal paste, even the most difficult thermal paste. And the second product kind of, negates the first one and just does the final cleanup. Let's get this water block installed. So the first thing I'm doing is removing the stock heat sinks. Now when you're removing any kind of heatsink, you wiggle it side to side. Sometimes they can be stuck really, really good. Wow, I'm really impressed with the thermal pads that MSI has used. These are really high quality thermal pads. They're not those, extremely sticky, terrible quality ones. And the bottom of this heatsink looks just as good as the top. So this is where you can really see the quality of this board. So sometimes you'll need to clean up any remaining thermal interface material because a lot of the low quality thermal pads that most manufacturers use actually stick and leave behind a lot of residue, but the high quality ones that MSI have used, beautiful, there's nothing left behind. Now for the thermal pads, this is what the manual says to do. So you can see here, the 1mm thermal pads, there's two arrows here showing the lower level and the upper level at the top. There's only one arrow here showing the lower level on the left side. So I don't understand why you would only cover these power phases and not these ones. Now I should listen to the manual, but these manuals are not always 100%. I've come across many situations where they're off. And there wasn't actually enough thermal pads to do this, which is usually a really good indicator that you're not supposed to. But I have more thermal pads, so I decided to give it a try. Because how you can easily tell if there's a problem is if the water block ends up on an angle, if it isn't parallel to the PCB. And you know immediately, even if it's 0.2 of a millimeter out, you can really quite easily see it. So I'm going to test it, make sure it has proper contact, and if it does, well, all good, I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to go against the manual. If it doesn't, I'll remove it and I'll do what the manual says. I have always stayed out of the thermal paste argument because everyone has a different way. Everyone always disagrees and trashes each other's different ways of doing it, and there are just so many different ways, so I just decided to stay completely out of it. And for the 6 years since I've started my channel, I've never said a word about it publicly. But when I saw the mess of the thermal paste that was on that motherboard, which you saw previously, I decided that it was time to talk about it. So you just saw how I apply my thermal paste. So just making sure that all of the washers are in position, the spacers. And we are now going to install this water block. So you can see I've installed the thermal paste very thinly. I've completely spread it out. Okay, I've taken a good look and the contact looks perfect and I can already feel the suction on the CPU. That's the great thing about applying it like this. The air bubbles just disappear immediately. Because it's already spread out, you hardly have to apply any pressure to finish the spread, and you just get immediate suction, and that suction shows that you've got really good coverage. Now that is a seriously awesome looking config. I can't wait until we get more of the components installed because we have so many perfectly matching components in this build. The color scheme is going to work extremely well, and it's all surrounding this motherboard. This board is definitely going to be the main feature of the build, the center. And you know, with this monoblock in combination with the Corsair Dominator Platinum, the M.2s, it's just a great looking config. And if you take a look at the coating on this motherboard, I have no idea what it actually is. It appears to be some sort of metallic paint, but they have done such a superb job with this board. It looks exactly like titanium. You know, when I was looking at the back of this board and I managed to get it onto a really acute angle in the right light, I actually started to see some of the different colors that you see in titanium, particularly when you heat it, you know, the blues and greens and purples. So it's an amazing looking coating, whatever it is. It's just a great looking motherboard. But anyway, this currently is just a test fit. I still need to get the radiator installed and also the power supply so that I can figure out exactly where I'm going to install the pump and res config. The rest of the components are from the previous config, so they all need a good cleanup before I can install them. But I'm going to get to that in the next part of the build log. So that sums up this video. Thanks for watching, and remember that none of this would be possible without our patrons.